Welcome to Session 2. Tricia Ebarvia is a member of the Educator Collaborative Network. She's been teaching English at Conestoga High School outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania since 2001. Tricia currently teaches 9th grade world literature as well as AP English Language and Composition and AP Seminar. Kate Roberts is a member of the Educator Collaborative Network. She's a national literacy consultant, top-selling author, and popular keynote speaker. She has taught reading and writing in Brooklyn, New York, and worked as a literacy coach before joining the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project in 2005, where she worked as a lead staff developer for 11 years. It is my pleasure to host their session, Getting Real, Finding Balance During Your Literacy Block.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Kate.
Hello, I'm Tricia.
And we are excited to take you through a bit of our journey of thinking today. And I think we especially like our title of Getting Real, because as Tricia and I were talking about, when we first started to think about this topic, we started thinking about that the problem we both face consistently in our work, and see if I characterize this right, Tricia, is how to balance all of the different desires and demands we have in our units and in our classroom. That there are all these texts we want to offer kids. There are all these questions and themes and ideas that we want to introduce them to and have them explore. There's all of these reading skills. That's my favorite moment that's ever happened, actually. That there's all this stuff that we're trying to get into a very sort of short amount of time. And so the getting real part is sort of us being okay, realistically, how can we help ourselves and maybe help other people to find that balance?
Yes, that's exactly right, Kate. I think it's hard. I think it was very real, even putting this presentation together, I will say. But it's overwhelming. I think teachers want to do so much and there really is very limited time. And so today we want to talk through a process that can all of us, and even just help ourselves clarify what can we do in the time that we have with kids to make it as valuable as possible. And there's no, I think, Kate, I'm speaking for Kate too, when I say that, if we were to give this presentation a year from now, we probably might have a few different answers because it's all a work in progress and we're all still trying to figure it out. And we welcome any suggestions from you. And yes, so let's get to this.
Okay, so we wanted to start really negative and talk about the problem and get more optimistic as the 50 minutes goes on. So as Tricia and I were thinking about what the problem is, we outlined a couple different things. So we actually got this partly from you all. We put out what do we call it, Tricia? A survey, a questionnaire. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Asking sort of what you find the most challenging, and people mostly talked about balance, right? How to balance meaningful units of instruction that doesn't get fragmented, how to balance small groups, etc. So as Trish and I were talking, we kind of broke it down into a few different problems that we faced. And really it's just not enough time, right? You can boil it down to there's not enough time to cover skills and content. I know for my own teaching, I often would go through these weeks and weeks of stuff with my kids, and it would be really powerful. Some of the experiences would be wonderful. But at the end of the unit, I would leave just sort of feeling what did we just do? Right? I know we did a lot of activities. I know we did a lot of things, but what is it that we learned during that time? And then, same kind of thing, not enough time for reading, writing, speaking, all the sort of skill needs that our kids have, how to fit it into the time that we have. And then there's all this sort of outside stuff. I don't know, Tricia, if you want to take that on.
Yeah, so I think that there are, I happen to be very lucky in teaching in a place where we don't have, I think, as many mandates as some other schools do. But I know, and I've talked to many teachers who have said that they have to be on this page in this unit on the same day or within this time frame. That there are standardized tests that the kids, we have state tests that come up, and how do we get kids ready for that as well as do all the other things, right?
Yep.
And all those demands are pressing, especially if you're in a state where part of your evaluation depends on those things. This is, I think we can I think we can say that I don't know that those are necessarily good measures of teaching, but those are the realities that we live in. And so how do we make space for all of these things and still be true to the kids in our classroom? Right?
Yeah, so like our main answer is that you can't.
No.
So we started talking and having this kind of great like text, email, hangout conversation where we realized that really it's this idea of, if I really want to give my kids something that's going to stick, I have to accept that I can't teach all of it. There's no way. Right. And Tricia came up with this. I love this phrase of the idea of being ruthless with your choices.
Yeah, you just have to, you have to be ruthless. I mean, I think every year teaching becomes kind of snowball effect, right? You start with like this limited piece of like, you have your unit, and then next year, like, oh, I can add that. And then the teacher brain never turns off. So you're constantly adding things to the things that you want to do with your kids. But all of that stuff takes time. So you have to be really ruthless with saying, okay, if I'm going to do this text, or if I'm going to focus on this skill, that means even if the thing that I did the year before was really great, maybe I need to cut that this year to make room for something else that meets my kids today where they are.
Right. This idea that almost like the less time you have, like I work with lots of teachers around the country, and sometimes I literally was in a place where they're like, basically, if you count sort of transition time, I have 35 minutes a day to teach.
Yeah.
Kids, right? And it's like, okay, like if that's the time I have, then I love this word, I have to be really ruthless and think, okay, I can't cover everything. I've got to pick like very little that I think is the stuff that my kids are going to resonate with, or that's going to shift them or empower them. Or the word we kept coming to is this idea of what is it in this whole mix of skills, questions, text, content, what is it that's going to make our kids more independent?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's the hill we're going to die on, right? I know I can get my kids to do a lot of things, right? I can get them to have these great experiences, but many mentors of mine continually focus on the idea that it doesn't matter much what I'm able to get my kids to do. It matters what the kids are able to do the next time they sit down with a book. Or
No, I was just going to piggyback and just say, Kate, it's just true. Like you won't be following the kids around. You can't follow them home and give them like questions as they're reading, and you can't. I joke about that with kids sometimes. I'm like, I can't follow you. I'm not going to, and that would be probably illegal. So we need to find ways so that they can have tools, right? And you do such a great job with this too. I mean, DIY literacy is one of my favorite books. But that idea that let's give kids the tools that they can use, that they can fall back on, and internalize so that they can approach any new text with confidence and, with confidence and ability. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So as we were talking, what was really fun about working with Tricia for me is that we realized as we talked out our process for unit planning and thinking about how the course of our teaching is going to go, we realized that we sort of fundamentally had different directions, that we covered the same bases, but we had different starting points and ending points. And so we thought it would be fun actually to take this time to share sort of two ways that you could think about your unit. Because I think one of the things that we came to that certainly isn't news, but it is nice to sort of revisit, is that we're not all the same as educators, right? Like we have different passions, different things that we prioritize in our classroom.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I'm going to start first, and we're going to kind of like emphasize different things so that we don't repeat each other. So I'm going to start off and do some thinking about how I plan units here. And so for me, let me see, I'm going to not screen share for a second. There we go. Hi. So for me, I'm a reading workshop person, right? Like that's how I was raised. And so a part of my true north is that when I start off thinking about a unit, I start thinking about skills first. I am embedded in that work. And so it's hard for me not to see through that lens when I'm beginning a course of study with my kids. So the way I start off thinking about a chunk of time with my students is looking at them and thinking about what kind of skills do these kids need to develop in order to become more independent, more empowered, more interested, let's just say for the context of this presentation, readers, right? Like, is it going to be that I have kids who are really having trouble like holding on to stories as they read? And so really, if I want them to be more independent readers, they need to focus in on things like, how do I monitor for how this text is making sense? How do I make sure I'm picking up all the phrases and fluent language in this text? How am I paying attention to the details, that kind of thing? Or are my kids like ready to take on things like interpreting themes or analyzing craft or something like that? So when I think about it, I again, teaching lots of different kinds of units. At the end, I sort of felt like I didn't always know what it is that my kids had learned. And so I want to take you through just a series of work that I think about as I'm starting off a unit and thinking about skills in general. The first thing is just understanding the difference between teaching skills versus teaching, say, a text or content, or I would argue even like essential questions or something like that. So like I took my wife, Maggie, Roberts, some of you may know her. My wife is gluten-free. And so we took a gluten-free pizza making class, which is sort of inherently depressing in and of itself. Sad thing, but I did it because I love her. And so we took this gluten-free pizza cooking class. And what struck me is that, the instructor didn't just make a pizza in front of us and show us everything. She didn't ask us questions about pizza. She didn't create activities about pizza. She didn't give us like, kinds of food that were like pizza to practice on, right? Like we had dough in front of us. She had dough in front of her, and she guided us through the making of pizza so that by the end of the class, we were better. And so this metaphorical question I ask about reading skills in particular is, can my students make the pizza on their own? So like whatever it is I'm asking them to do in a unit, the central question is, can they read these texts on their own powerfully? Can they ask if I have essential questions? Can they ask those essential questions on their own powerfully without my help? And of course, can they apply or transfer the work to another text? So that to me is sort of the question that guides me. I start with skills. So that question is, what kind of reading work is going to most empower my students as readers of any text? And to do that kind of thinking, like it was helpful for me to consider a kind of hierarchy of skills. It's not true that these skills happen in an order, really. I know that reading skills mush together. But it's important, I think, to have a kind of hierarchy in my mind of what reading skills matter first for most readers. That like, if I look at this list, if I'm not monitoring for sense, then I'm probably not understanding the text. So nothing else matters after that, right? I'm always going to be dependent on something, a book on tape, a teacher, a partner, a spark note, something. If I'm not able to actually make sense of the words and the story in front of me or the text in front of me. Then things like fluency and envisioning help me to scoop up more details, like to make sure I'm picking up lots of phrases, not just the first phrase or clause of a sentence, that I'm hearing tone of voice, that I'm looking at description. Then being able to do things like infer around character. So am I making those leaps? Am I doing some of those like sort of foundational idea making moves as I read, which leads me to be able to then think about things like theme, or interpreting a text, or analyzing craft, or reading with a critical lens like gender, race, and class, or power, or Marxism, whatever the lens is that you want to apply to the text. And so when I'm looking at my kids and I'm thinking about a unit, for me, before I get into what the text is going to be, before I get into what big questions we're going to ask of the text, I like to just look at my kids and be like, well, I know I'm going to be asking them to read in these next few weeks, like a lot. hopefully, on their own, what is it that they need to get better at to become more powerful readers without me? Because I found that just helps so much of the work go better if my kids can do the reading without as much help as I found they often have. So that's fine. And, those of you who are watching who are like 3-5 people, or even some 6-8 people, you might feel really comfortable with this list and know how to like assess your kids in like a reading conference or something like that. But like when I started teaching, I had 3 classes of 8th graders, which is not bad. I had double periods. I was very lucky. But I had like 36 to 40 kids in my class, right? And so the idea of like looking at, class 803 and trying to figure out which of these skills is a priority for them felt really daunting to me. Like I felt like I was just going to be guessing, right? Well, they're 8th graders, so they should be able to do those first 3. So let's just say they can. And that wound up not feeling good enough. So over the years, through working with the Reading and Writing Project and then beyond, like I started thinking about some really usable assessments that I could give kids. And I hate saying that word, like it actually makes me cringe a little bit because we use it way too much. Taking a sip of coffee to get me through the assessment conversation. Oh my gosh, right? The idea of data, of assessing, I think has gotten so overused and so sort of co-opted by all these other sort of interests that aren't my interest as a classroom teacher, right? Like I can get down with needing data for other purposes, but when I'm in my classroom, like what I need is like some quick information that's going to guide my teaching. I developed, this is just one version. Obviously, there's lots of different versions that you could make. There's probably lots of different versions out there. A reading skills assessment that can give me like a good sense of where kids are at with some of these sort of basic skills that I want my kids to have. So I can give them a text, hopefully that they can read with some strength and independence, or I can read aloud an excerpt. And I can ask them general questions like this. What are the 3 most important moments in this story and why? Analyze the main character. What themes does the author develop in the story? What craft moves do you notice the author using, and what is their purpose? And I have these questions purposely vague. I know that some kids might just not understand what I mean by analyze the main character, but in a way that's an assessment of it in and of itself. Like as kids get older, like they will be expected to just be able to know how to talk about characters and themes without a ton of scaffolding, coaching, prompting, massaging into it. So I keep those questions super vague, partly so that I can assess really what do kids understand about character, theme, craft, but also because I want this assessment to be able to be used on any text so I can give it a bunch of times. It's not text dependent, I think any narrative text I could probably start to ask these questions around. Because if I want to collect data, it's going to be helpful if I do it like before the unit and maybe after the unit. So I give these questions to kids, but I got to tell you, like my 3 classes of 8th graders, this is going to give me, question 1 looks at monitoring for sense, like what's important, what's significant. Question 2 looks at inferring. Question 3 looks at interpretation. Question 4 looks at analyzing craft, right? So fine, I get this stack. 803 takes the assessment. It's awesome. I mean, they're not having any fun, but it's short, so it's painless. That's fine. And then I take it. And the problem is then I have a stack of papers on my desk. If I want to sort of get a sense of what's reading skill my kids really need to develop independently, I can't have a stack of papers on my desk. Like I've got to get the information in this assessment out of the stack and in a usable form so that I can like use the data to nudge my teaching. Like, how do I see a class of kids and be able to see both their trends as a group, but also like the outliers and the kids who might need some help? So Maggie and I actually developed a grid that was helpful for that, of how do I take a stack like this and turn it into something where I can see my class. So this is just a grid. Obviously, it's super fancy. It's just Sharpie on a piece of paper. Copyright K. Roberts. And on the left-hand side are the skills that the questions represent, and then like some levels like high, medium, low, or beginning, intermediate, advanced. And then as I'm going through my assessments and looking at question 1, I take Kate's name when she puts it, and I put it sort of where I think she lies on that level of question, like where is she in that work? And what's I found really lovely and helpful about this then is that I have like a real sense here of like where my unit should be probably if I'm really concerned about the whole class. And we could debate it, but when I used this specific grid with a teacher, we were like, okay, determining importance, most of my kids are pretty functional. Character analysis, most of my kids are pretty functional. So I could do a sort of character 2.0 unit, but really the thing that started to concern us was that many, many, many of the kids weren't able to start to identify themes on their own, that we saw a real dependence. Like a lot of these kids could do theme if I coached them, pushed them, scaffolded them, but like they weren't able to just automatically like pick up a text and be like, seems like this is about loss. Or like, I see some gender stuff here. I think it's talking about like power dynamics between the genders or something like that. So this grid was helpful to us to do that. Because what I really want to do if I'm starting from skills or when I get to the place of thinking about skills in a unit is to make sure that the skill I choose to focus on as a whole class is going to fit the actual human beings in front of me and is going to be a skill that they quote unquote need some development around. So that's one sort of big thing when I'm starting off with skills is like before I even get to the teaching of the skill, I've got to figure out how do I collect some information that's going to be helpful and usable to me to find out what skill I should even focus on in the first place. All right, I'm going to keep on talking. Are we good, Tricia? So yeah, okay. So then I say, let's say interpretation is my skill for this group, right? This is the one that I really want to focus on. Now I'm going to think about the strategies. And this is, again, I'm a reading workshop person. That's my sort of true north. So, me knowing that my kids need help interpreting, like, isn't going to help me much. Like, so many times when I first started teaching, so many times when I was in the classroom, all the way in grade school, middle school, high school, even college, I felt like what my teachers did is they just asked me to perform the skill. They would just say like, what's the theme, for lack of a better, more nuanced question. And like, either you knew how to answer that question or you didn't, right? And then if we didn't know how to do it, sometimes they would encourage us, but it wasn't like particularly helpful. They'd like repeat themselves or they'd give another example of a theme or something like that. But like when we couldn't answer the question or like analyzing craft, I remember all the time in English class, my teachers would be like, what's this symbolize? What does this symbolize? What is this? It just felt like everything was a symbol. And I never sort of could crack the code of what things symbolized. And no one ever really taught me like how you do that work. So to me, the skill is just the beginning. It's the what, it's the goal. What I am passionate about with Reader's Workshop is that I think Reader's Workshop really coaches us to focus on what the strategies are that help kids take tiny steps towards that goal. Like not mastery, just like, wow, you can't think of any theme at all. After you use this strategy for a little bit, you're going to be able to come up with rough draft themes on your own pretty easily after this. I think that's like very typical in reading and writing. It's also really typical in life. Like my wife and I, our eldest son, he's having some trouble like entering rooms when he's nervous. Like he won't go to a birthday party right now. There's just some stuff going on. So one skill that he needs to work on is entering a room when he's nervous. Us just telling him, dude, just enter the room isn't going to help him. Us giving him repeated exposure to that isn't going to help him necessarily. Like what we found helps him work on this big, hard skill of his is these tiny little things that he can try until he finds like the right fit. Like taking a deep breath and blowing the candles out on an imaginary cake, or, just thinking to yourself, I can do this. Or the third one is the one that really works for him right now, currently at 4 years old, like just figuring out a first step, like he'll just get to the cubby and then he could get to the cubby and then he gets to like the table or something like that. So for me, like I think about skills, like what skills do my kids really need to become more powerful readers? But then it's all about like, what are the strategies that are going to support that skill? This is an example of a list that goes along with interpreting text for me. And each of these, like, there's no one strategy that's going to like necessarily create mastery around a skill. But there's like a dance and an interplay and a stacking of these strategies that's going to give our kids some muscles to be able to do this work again more independently and more powerfully in the text. So like this, the first four strategies for interpreting text that I like is like that first we just notice problems, struggles, and conflicts in text. But once we do that, we think, what's this text saying about those problems? And lots of times kids will come up with, rough draft themes doing those two strategies. Like they'll say like, well, like love's a problem in this text. You'll be like, cool. Okay, what's this text saying about that? And they'll say like, love is hard. And at first, sometimes, I have an instinct to sort of pull back on that and be like, okay, what else? What else can you say? But I want that to be like high fives, right? Because they're starting to do interpretation on their own. And there's next steps I can give them. Like for me, once I have a list of strategies like this, I'm sort of liberated in a way because I always have another thing I can offer a kid who's struggling to do something in my class. Like strategy 3, closely read scenes where those issues are arising. Like what are they suggesting? And then the next one was really helpful for kids. Like when you're analyzing those scenes, you think about like the exact emotions, what the effect of the problem is or problems are, what the causes are, what lessons are revealed, blah, blah, blah. So if I think of a sequence of work, I got to figure out what skills my kids need. And then I got to find a bunch of strategies for those skills. And then I just make sure that those strategies like work. So I'm going to end pretty soon, and we're not going to really practice it too much, but I've been reading Passing. Oh, that's mirror image there. It's Passing by Nella Larson. And like, I've just been practicing this work as I read, just to make sure, again, like, are these strategies going to work for people? And so like, I know that a theme in this text is like jealousy, resentment, race, gender. There's a lot of class in here too. And so as I read this scene, I can think about like, jealousy or resentment. And, if I don't have a strategy to help me analyze the scene in relation to jealousy and resentment, I'm going to have the same thinking kind of at the end of this scene without a teacher's help than I did at the beginning. If I started off this scene thinking jealousy is hard, I'm going to read the scene and be like, yep, I see it again. Jealousy is hard. So instead, I unpack this scene and I can say things like, well, is there a reason for jealousy here? And there's a line on the second paragraph that says, Irene answered promptly, no, why should I? And so disdainful was her voice and manner that Claire's face flushed and her eyes glinted. And later on, Claire's kind of mean to Irene. And so one thing I noticed is that like jealousy sometimes is caused when people not just have what you want, but when they're like mean about it or superior about it. Right. And so these strategies, like that one strategy of saying you can read a scene, and when you have an idea of an issue, you can read the scene thinking, is there a cause of that issue here? Is there an effect of that issue? Like that one strategy can unlock a whole bunch of work for kids that then I don't have to like do whole class conversation with all the time. So that's kind of my big spiel. I'm taking on the skills part a little bit because that's where I start. Like I tend to start with like, what skills do my kids need to be more independent in or with? And then I go on like a mad hunt for the strategies that I want to teach them about that. Because after that, it's about repetition, right? Like if I'm doing a whole class text, it's about teaching these strategies in the whole class text and then applying them to book clubs. Or if I'm in reading workshop, it's about that repetitive practice of like, all right, here are some strategies that really tend to help people interpret text more powerfully. We're going to do it once on this class text. Now you're going to do it again. Now you're going to do it again. And that I've seen has sort of built those muscles that allow kids to be more independent. So one way we can, I messed my hair up because I was just wildly talking. Whoa, no one saw me. So I was like running my hand through my hair and gesticulating wildly. One way that we can go through a unit, right, is to start with this idea of what are the skills that my kids need to be more independent, to be more powerful readers, and kind of build from there. And if I'm going to do that work, this might be a sequence of work that can help us do that. But it's not the only way. And with that, I'll pass it off to Tricia.
Okay, well, Kate, I was taking notes and tweeting at the same time while you were going. I was like, oh, that's a good idea. I want to write that down.
I have my pen ready to go now.
And I was just thinking about what I really love is that I don't think, as a high school teacher who spent all my life in 9 through 12, we are not good, or we have not really, our training has not included teaching reading. Like it just hasn't. It has been exactly like when you were saying, like we just ask kids, what's the theme, or analyze the symbol. I'm like, and then you just ask the same question over and over again without actually giving them the strategy of how to find it. I was like, that was me for much of my career, and then getting frustrated. And then that's when you get kids just spitting things back out at you, right? That's why they can just read SparkNotes or Schmoop or whatever the countless number of things are now, because that's sufficient for them, because we're just passing off literature as if it's content to be passed down and like consumed rather than something to engage with. So I love this idea of, and I'm trying to get better at it, as using literature as a way to, using the text as a way to get at those skills that kids can then transfer for their own learning, for whenever they go into any other text, be it a piece of literature or a tweet or a blog post or a video, and be critical readers of that, right? So, so as Kate mentioned, we do go at this from sort of different angles. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we do go through these things at different angles. I think you can see that. Hold on, let me just double check to make sure. Can you see that, Kate? Can you just?
It's totally good.
All right, good. Okay, so like learning, teaching requires multiple access points. So another approach, so Kate starts with skills, and then she moves to text and text sets and gets kids to start asking questions about them. And I actually do it in the opposite way. And I move from essential questions to text and text sets and skills. So it was really interesting when we were talking about what is our process. And it's not that either one is right or wrong. It's just that these are different access points that teachers might feel more comfortable with. But either way, what you'll notice is that we don't start with the text. So I think that some of our, if language shapes reality, I think too many of us are guilty of saying things like, I'm going to teach The Great Gatsby now, or I'm going to go teach The Crucible, or now I'm in my Things Fall Apart unit. So we're, even in our language, is reinforcing this idea that the text is content to be consumed and to be performed and to be assessed on, rather than thinking about the questions and the skills. Because I think at the end of the day, those as starting and endpoints are really the most important things that we can give kids, because texts and text sets will change. They change over time, and they should, right? The canon, those of you who know, I collaborate on the Disrupt Text chat and project with 3 other wonderful women, Dr. Kim Parker, Julia Torres, and Lorena Gurman. But I mean, at the end of the day, text and text sets change. Canon is dynamic. But what we want to focus on are the questions that drive us as human beings, and the skills that will help us to ask those questions and get to them. So what I've been doing is I've been thinking about like big ideas, and then thinking about I'll choose a big idea, and I'll come up with some essential questions. And now, again, this is teacher driven to some extent, although you'll see I allow space and time always, even if it's directed by me at first, to have kids come up with sub questions, or have kids come up with related questions, or have kids sometimes have a text, and after we've been doing a lot of essential question work, to have them come up with the things that they think that the text is about. But some considerations in thinking about big ideas, of course, like we mentioned before, making sure that we have requirements like your course department. Right now, the context of what most of I'll be sharing today is the new course that I'm teaching, which is American literature. I've been away for about 13 years or so. I taught it for, earlier in my career, and I'm back I'm very excited. And I think authenticity for sure. So I think we have to think about the questions that are important to kids right now, and that can be tied to what they're seeing in the world. Because if you're asking questions that they can't see immediately that's happening in the news or that's happening like sort of readily available, it's only going to reinforce the idea that school is school and the real world is the real world, right? That there's this kind of wall between them. And I think we need to help kids think a little bit beyond that and see that, oh, like as I scroll through my Twitter feed or my Instagram, I see something. This is the same question that we're talking about in English class. And then, of course, student engagement, so thinking again, one of the things that was so great listening to Kate is just her emphasis always on kids. What do my kids need to know? What do my kids, where are my kids' strengths? What do they bring? And so thinking about questions that, are gripping for them, are interesting for them. So I actually use, and I've been doing some work with this, and our district has actually moved towards using the Teaching Tolerance social justice standards. So I'm going to be speaking from kind of working through a unit as how I would plan with these standards in mind. They're wonderful. There's four anchors, which are four standards actually, identity, diversity, justice, and action. And you can find these all on their website. It's an amazing organization. If you have a chance to go to one of their workshops, I can't recommend it enough. Val Brown, who is one of the facilitators of Teaching Tolerance, is going to actually be doing a study series for the EdCollab. I think it's the first one, so please don't miss that. But these four standards are the ways that we can think about making our curriculum. When we think about authenticity and relevance and meaning, I think these bring all of that together. It's a frame that I have found, and I've been searching, but it's a frame that I have found to be really cohesive. So I'll just walk through. So one big idea I was thinking about when we think about America or American literature is this idea of home. What is home? What does it mean? And especially with the news today, watching this entire summer, the crisis at the borders with children being separated and, refugees and asylum seekers coming to the United States. I am a second generation Filipino American. My parents came here to the United States in the 70s. Had they tried to come here to the US to make their home even 10 or 15 years earlier, they would not have been able to because of the immigration laws that were in place. So this idea of home is personal to me, but I think it's something that relates to all kids. So when we go through the standards, I'll just share some questions that I've come up with that I think help kids through. So as far as identity standard is about self. I think all learning starts with self, doing that internal work. So what does home mean to me? Where do I feel most at home? Where do I locate my home? And important to think about not just, kids will go to that, what's the cliche, the home is where the heart is. So it's not necessarily always a physical space. Diversity, how do others define home? How do our shared and differing ideas of home reveal culture and social identities? For many populations and communities, home is also about language. So I think that is something that, kids can talk about and think about. Justice, in what ways have homes, physical, cultural, and social, been passed down and protected, but then also threatened and erased? And finally, moving to action, how can we ensure that all people have opportunities to build and sustain homes or a sense of home for themselves? What I love about this framework is that it does move from self to text and to think about systems, and then to think about what can we do from there. So again, making the personal connected to others and to the world. So after I've developed sort of those essential questions, leaving room, of course, for kids to sort of process all of those, I think about what will my texts and text sets be? And this is just naturally how my thinking works. How do I choose? So I think about which text will speak to the essential questions first, since that was my starting point. But then I move to skills and I think about, what are the skills that my students need right now? And will this text support that skill? As Kate was saying earlier, if kids are having a hard time determining importance or thinking about theme, will this text be able to help kids offer kids an opportunity to practice that skill and practice the strategies to develop that skill. And finally, of course, are the texts that I'm choosing, are they inclusive and are they diverse? In finding balance, I think, with all of this means choosing with intention. Earlier, we said that, in term, you can't do it all, you have to accept it. And so if you can't do it all, you have to be ruthless. So another word for ruthless, maybe, I like ruthless, but another word might be intentional, right? So how can we be intentional about how inclusive our texts are? We have to know our why. So I'll plug another teaching time. I swear I'm not promoting. They're just really good. I'm not, everything they do is just really quality stuff. So, but I really love their, they have a guide, a tool for choosing diverse texts. And so they have 4 considerations. So you can see that on their website. So, but I love that tool as well. All right, so here's a lot of stuff that's going on. And I think I'll definitely share these slides later if you can't, if you don't get to, see them up close right now, because I'm going to go a little quickly. But if we're looking at the idea of home, essential questions, and text sets, this is kind of what the plan looks like. So I might start with this, I believe, essay centered on the theme of home. And there's so many beautiful ones there. I mean, you just go to this, I believe, website, personal essays, accounts, testimonies, search home. It's endless, the numbers. I just checked this morning. And you can read mentor texts, and then students will write their own. And so it's really about thinking about what centers me, where do I find my place? And then because I'm teaching American literature, one of the units that is new actually for this year, as I've come back to the course, is a Native and Indigenous unit. And so thinking about the idea of home, how can I introduce kids to whole class texts that we can read together and come to some shared understanding of how others view home. So for example, how home has been defined in varying First Nations peoples. What does that mean? What does it look like? How does it impact their lives and our history? So here I have some text, some poetry that we read together, but then also some testimonies and narratives of Native and Indigenous people who were taken from their home with the residential schools, and of course the Indigenous people's history of the United States, excerpts from that. So by looking at this poetry and by looking at the testimonies of and the narratives and memoirs of people who have gone through this experience in terms of losing, creating, rebuilding homes, then we can develop a sense of what does it mean to have a home for different people, and how does that look like over time? And then we go to book clubs. So the idea is that the skills that we practice in looking at the poetry and nonfiction, students can then choose their own, choose their own adventure, I suppose, but they can choose their own text. We have some book club selections here. The Marrow Thieves, if you haven't read it, is just beautiful. It is my favorite book in the last year or so that I've probably read. I know the EdCollab it was one of their summer reading selections. It's just beautiful. I can't say enough about it. And so this goes, you can kind of see here the progression, right? So kids are thinking about self, then they're thinking about what does home mean to others. And then they're in the book clubs, they're looking at, okay, well, how have homes been protected, threatened? How have they been sustained, but also erased through these different experiences that they read in their individual book club selections? And then as far as actions are concerned, one thing that, especially with this particular unit, I'm coming to you right outside of Philadelphia. So here, well, really like any area in the United States, there's a lot of Native history here, and thinking about the ways in which we can ask students to look at how we have these, the Schuylkill River and like Susquehanna, and like we have all these names that come from Native and Indigenous people, but also where are people, right? Where we have to think about the ways that their history and stories and homes have been erased. Another possible entry point into action might be to think about racism of Native American mascots. And that is something that we are currently developing and working on. Again, after kids have sort of developed this understanding of, identity and home and what it means to different communities. And then the last thing that I have there is just there's a beautiful selection of op docs from the New York Times, conversations with different communities of color on race. So here I'm just going to go really quickly through because I know we only have like 5 minutes. So here I'm just going to talk a little again. What I just shared on the previous slide is really a unit that I think could work for if you're looking at specifically a Native and Indigenous literature unit. But I think this idea of home, especially in an American Lit course, is limitless. Right? You can take the essential questions that I had a few pages ago and you can apply them to looking at texts like these, like The Great Gatsby, right? And of course, Raisin in the Sun. So that's a pairing that I think many teachers are familiar with and could work really well, like side by side. But I think you can also look at something like Fallen Angels, which is Walter Dean Meyer's book. Actually, my students just finished reading, or they read it over the summer, and think about Vietnam. And one of the central themes in there is how the soldiers are always, writing letters home, thinking about home. What does that mean? But then to pair that with the narrative of someone who is Vietnamese and Vietnamese American, a refugee, displaced by the Vietnam War, and this beautiful graphic memoir, The Best That We Could Do, about that experience, about finding a new home across the ocean. Then, of course, we can think about what does home mean when you are a Japanese American living during World War II and your home is taken away from you because of the war and Pearl Harbor, and what happens when you were sent to basically an incarceration camp. So The Emperor Was Divine is one look at that. And then to connect that to today, we can look at works like Citizen Illegal. And to think about who gets to call America home and what does that mean? How can we define it? I love this text. This is a nonfiction text. Tell Me How It Ends. It's an essay in 40 questions. The 40 questions refers to the 40 questions that are asked of asylum seekers at the border. And the essay opens, it's a small text. The essay opens with, why did you come to the United States? And just reading the answers about finding a home or that home is not safe is just remarkable. And to have kids to kind of grapple with that too, I think could be potentially very powerful. And I'm currently reading this book right here, Pride by Ibi Zoboi, and it's beautiful. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a remix of Pride and Prejudice. And if you just look at that opening line, right, I'll just read it really quickly. It's a universally acknowledged truth that when rich people move into the hood, where it's a little bit broken and a little bit forgotten, the first thing they want to do is clean it up. But it's not just the junky stuff they'll get rid of. People can be thrown away too, like last night's trash left out on sidewalks or pushed to the edge where all broken things go. And again, like this idea of gentrification and what happens to people's homes as they are changed and other people move in and other people are perhaps forced out. It can be, again, another powerful thing for kids to consider. And that, of course, can lead, I think this is my last slide for pairings, but that, of course, can lead to the beautiful book by Matthew Desmond, Evicted, about evictions and the system of evictions and racism behind them in the United States. And this another wonderful text, The Wangs versus the World by Jay Chang, which is about a Chinese American family who lose their home, lose their money, and their attempts to find a new place and what it means for different characters in the book. It's really kind of a journey story. So those are things that I focus on a lot when, thinking about how can you take that one big idea home, bring some essential questions to it that feel like they are a progression and a framework, and then selecting text that will help kids grapple with those things. And then, of course, skills. So here, of course, are the, a summary of what I was looking at. So at each level of the standards for the social justice standards, the text that I'm looking at, but then thinking about skills. So there's, of course, writing skills. So always teaching kids to read like a writer, this type of essays with the mentor text. I am a big fan of the National Writing Project's Analytic Writing Continuum. It has 6 different sort of standards and content, organization, voice, word choice, sentence fluency conventions, but always prioritizing, because I always feel like I can't, all 6 of those at any given time is too much for any kid to think about. So which is the focus area. And for some students, it might be different focus areas. So as you go through the year, you can kind of tailor your instruction to help students work with the area that they are maybe weakest at, right? And of course, writer's notebooks, mentor sentences, mini lessons, all that stuff. And in this particular unit, there will be 2 types of writing, personal essay and opinion writing when we get to the action part. Now, thinking about state and district standards, if you just look at the writing process skills that we're working on, there's no way that none of these or don't align with state and district standards. It's just a matter of like checking boxes for your, basically just checking boxes. I mean, I think that if instruction is done well, and if standards are generally well-intentioned at least, then I think that you will be able to find the overlap, right? So that we're not starting with the state and district standards or starting with the mandates per se, but we're starting with what we know works for kids. And then finally, of course, the reading workshop, as Kate has gone through with all the ways that we can use reading workshop to help kids develop skills and strategies. So one thing that I have thought very, okay, see we're running out of time, so I'm just going to go through really quickly. One last thing is that when I do the whole class text and independent reading, I think Kate would definitely, I know, knows this too, or agrees that whatever we're asking kids to do with whole class text, that they model, that they practice in their independent reading, and that they just work together seamlessly that way. This is my 43-minute class period. It is a little crazy. It is 5 to 8 minutes of writing, 25 minutes of whatever the lesson might be, and always ending with 10 to 12 minutes of independent reading to keep that fluency going. I'm going to stop sharing now so I can come back in here and see everybody. Maybe. Can you see? Yeah, here I am. Sorry. Okay, that was fast.
No, we crammed it all in. Nice job.
I know. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's already time.
Okay, that's how you do a unit.
Yes.
So, that was awesome. I just took a bunch of notes too. I'm really excited. It's cool because as Trish and I were talking, we realized that we have these different sort of areas of emphasis in our work, right? Like I always emphasize skills and strategies, and Trish is so masterful at thinking about these questions so thoughtfully. And obviously the text work is just a gift that you give to all of us to teach us how to do that so much better and so much more thoughtfully than I know I have in the past sometimes. But it like doesn't matter what direction you go in, right? I think that's where we kind of want to leave, is saying like, so I start from skills because that's my leaning, but I need to learn from people like Tricia how to then think about texts and questions or themes that tie this work together in a more thoughtful way.
I think, Kate, let's just like merge. We're just doing merging.
Voltron the situation.
We'll just be one with the Borg.
Exactly. So we're over time, but we hope that's all helpful. And of course, you can reach out to us on our various platforms of Twitter and et cetera.
Yes.
If questions come up.
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks, Kate. This was great.
It was fun.
And thank you, Kristen.
All right. Well, hope you'll join us for session 3 workshops: assessment as learning, falling in love with ed tech for littles, and we are all learners. Thank you.